I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. This week I'll speak with Michael Kimmelman, the founder of the New York Times Headway initiative and the chief architecture critic. We'll discuss why high-speed rail is so hard to build in America. But first, Andy Newman of the Times. He's been shedding light on how the city grapples with rising homelessness and mental health challenges. In his recent reporting, Andy explored the Lenniger Residences, a permanent supportive housing community in the Bronx that currently serves 60 formerly homeless residents who have had mental health challenges. Andy, how has that program worked?
The one thing that permanent supportive housing is very good at is keeping people housed and preventing them from going back to homelessness. At the Lenniger, as at many other supportive housing complexes, there are, you get your own apartment. There are social services that are offered on site. You have a case manager who works downstairs who you're supposed to meet with semi-regularly. There are doctors who make site visits. There are various kinds of services offered on site. And at the Lenniger, over 90% of the tenants stay either there stably or they move on to other forms of permanent housing. But people generally tend not to go back to homelessness, which is a great thing.
Providing all these social services is pretty expensive, though, isn't it?
It is somewhat expensive. The city health department pays about $24,000 a year per person just for the social services part. People's rent usually comes out of their disability check, which is taxpayer money also. On the other hand, if you keep somebody in a homeless shelter, that costs about $50,000 a year. If people who are homeless and unstable spend more time in hospitals, in jails, both of those cost far more than housing somebody at a place like the Lenniger.
So theoretically, the program at Lenniger that you wrote about in the Bronx can be replicated elsewhere around the city when we're talking about so many homeless people who do have mental problems.
Yes, but
there's always a but.
There is always a but. There is a lot of debate about whether, like, when people talk about people who are homeless and experiencing mental illness, they usually mean like the person who you see in the subway who's like completely disheveled and maybe muttering to themselves and, you know, seem like they're delusional and psychotic. And there is some debate about whether someone who's in that bad condition can simply be moved directly into something like supportive housing. And people tend to go through some kind of transitional step. Often it involves having to go to a hospital and get pretty stabilized before you're really ready to live in a somewhat functional way. So there is that's a piece that we sort of haven't really totally mastered yet, which is how to get people from complete like decompensation and psychosis into a place where they can actually stay and not just kind of wig out.
Andy, I'm not asking you for your opinion on this, but just generally, you've covered social services for the New York Times for so long. What about involuntary treatment, taking these people who are the cases you talk about on the subway? How do you get them into treatment for the transition then into supportive housing?
I mean, this is something that the people who make policy have been grappling with forever and ever. And every time there's like a random crime or an attack, there is a whole outcry of people saying we cannot just simply, you know, walk by someone who's in very bad shape because for their own good, but also for the public safety of the city. It just makes New Yorkers very nervous if they feel that everybody who they walk by in the street is about to possibly attack them. Governor Hochul has been pushing to try to do several things to make it easier to involuntarily take people off the street or out of the subway and send them to a hospital. She's getting a lot of pushback from civil liberties people on that and from some of the more left-leaning state legislators. Mayor Adams, he and members of his staff have been pushing and begging the governor to do more to help people get involuntarily removed from the street. But there's always going to be a lot of resistance to that. The problem with involuntary removal is that often what happens is that someone will be brought in involuntarily to a hospital. They're supposed to be assessed there and really kept there. If they need to be kept there, they need to be treated until they're stable and ready to move on to something else. But what ends up happening much more often is that someone goes to a hospital, the hospital is completely overfull, has usually very few psychiatric beds, has a big demand to move people out of there as quickly as possible. And so the hospitals will often do something that in the short term helps someone stabilize, but as soon as they seem like they're stable for the time being, they will, discharge them, and then someone will leave the hospital, immediately stop taking the meds that had helped them stabilize, and just go back to the same cycle. So permanent supportive housing has a role to play in that, but it's sort of further down the road once someone has stabilized.
You pointed out in your article in the Times that some fiscal conservatives think this is not the best approach, offering low-cost housing without requiring them to accept services or to work enables drug use and other social woes. How do we reconcile those two things?
I don't know how we do reconcile, and you're correct that all those social services we were talking about at places like the Lenniger, they are voluntary. You don't need to take your meds. You don't need to stop using drugs. About 3/4 of the Lenniger's residents in the supportive housing side have active substance abuse problems. That's according to the former program director at the Lenniger. So there, it's a pretty challenging situation. The alternative, the sort of thing that conservatives tend to favor, which is maybe having a work requirement, a sobriety requirement, something to kind of indicate that you're like trying to get your life together as opposed to just simply getting off the street. That scares off a lot of people. If you're someone who's been avoiding shelters and you're offered an apartment, but you have to totally kind of clean up your life, that scares a lot of people off.
Or they're not capable of it.
Or they're not capable, or they're not ready. Sometimes people think they're ready and they will move in to one of those places that has requirements for sobriety or something like that, and they'll start using again and they'll fail out. So the plus side of permanent supportive housing, the way it's constructed and handled in this country, is that it makes it easy for you to stay because it asks very little of you. The downside is that it's true. It's like there are people who live in the Lenniger who have been, just kind of spinning their wheels for many, many years and feel like they're kind of stuck there. And it's, it doesn't solve everyone's problems.
Again, you've been covering social services for a long time at the Times. If there's one thing that the city could do to make the situation better, is there a magic bullet?
It seems to me that it would be good to have more programs that would take people who are in the worst condition on the streets and in the subways of the city and have them go to a place where they can get treated until they are stable, and if they can't be made stable, I don't know what the I don't know what the solution is. We don't
And
really
that's
want
sort
to.
of what Governor Hochul is proposing.
What she's proposing sort of kind of nibbles around the edges of that a little bit more. I mean, we don't want to lock people away for life. We did that, you know, in the earlier part of the 20th century, and you know, there were all these warehouses of misery, these institutions with hundreds or thousands of people in them who were not really even getting much treatment. So that's not the answer, but what the answer is very unclear.
I guess if you knew the answer, you might be the commissioner.
Maybe.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andy Newman of the New York Times. Coming up next, the challenges facing public sector high-speed rail projects with Michael Kimmelman, chief architecture critic of the New York Times. Federal funding challenges loom over public transit projects. New York Times Headway founder and architecture critic Michael Kimmelman recently examined Brightline, a privately operated rail service in Florida. It successfully revitalized intercity passenger rail travel. But public sector initiatives like California's high-speed rail project are struggling. What does that say about the future of high-speed rail in the Northeast and the rest of America? Michael, why is it working in Florida and not elsewhere?
Well, part of it is that the company, Brightline, is owned by an investment bank that owned already the freight lines on which it travels. So,
And these are the original Flagler freight lines, right?
right, people may forget, but Rockefeller's partner and an oil tycoon, Henry Flagler, moved to Florida and basically created Florida as we know it, building a rail line that also served places like Miami and Palm Beach, which had really not been on the map. And so it was partly a real estate deal, partly a transportation deal for Flagler. Those tracks that he built morphed into freight lines. The passenger rail train that he had died out. Years ago, the cars came in and so forth. And so Brightline basically decided we could turn this into a passenger rail. And some of it is what you could only loosely call high speed, where the train jogs from the existing tracks over towards Orlando. It goes a little faster. But the key thing about this was it owned its right of ways. So it didn't have to negotiate like the California high-speed train over property issues and ownership and all sorts of boundaries. And then it really was stressing this one particular route, which was Miami to Orlando, intercity, with the hope to expand to Tampa. So it wasn't trying to compete with commuter rail. It was doing one thing, catering basically to tourists and conventioneers, and at a distance which interestingly is roughly 200 miles. In other words, a pain to drive, a pain to fly.
Right.
And the question was whether or not enough of the tens of millions of people who travel between those two cities, Orlando and Miami, would switch to rail for the convenience and reliability.
And is it working?
And it's working so far. Well, it's working with some qualifications, serious ones. But several million people have started to ride it already, and their expectation is they can increase those numbers each year. The qualifications, the trains are moving quickly on existing tracks that weren't really built for fast trains. So there have been quite a number of people who've died crossing the tracks, trying to go around the barriers, unaccustomed to train travel. And also, it's a very particular kind of train. So it's not the same as Amtrak. It's not the same as our subway system. It's filling a niche. But I'll say the key thing about it is this niche has been identified by Brightline as something that exists around the country. So the second line they're building is between Las Vegas and the suburbs of Los Angeles, a very heavily trafficked route, which has no train, and which they're hoping can convert some of the 50-odd million people who make that trip either flying or driving. If they get 8 or 9 million people to do it, it's profitable. And again, back to real estate, they've bought about 100 acres on the Las Vegas Strip where their station will be built. And so as they hope around Florida, stations where they've built some buildings and sold them already, they see this as a real estate deal. So it's very much a private venture. The question is, how can that be extended, and is there a public ability to do something similar?
How is the price compared to flying, say, and what is the speed from Miami to Orlando?
So the speed is a little less than it would be to drive, but you don't have to drive.
You don't have to drive. And you're not using gas.
Correct, and it's dynamic pricing, so the prices vary a lot. It's not a discount train. There had been in the beginning sort of deals for commuters who were going on part of the route, say Miami and Palm Beach or Miami and Boca Raton. But Brightline's economic model really is to create something that's kind of like the airline pricing. Depends on when you're going, depends on whether you're in first class or coach. It's high end up to a point, meaning, you know, for New York City subway riders, this will be very far end, but you have sort of airport style lounges. The seats are leather and space, you know, lots of space.
Why can't we have trains like they have in Europe or Japan?
So that's the question this raises, and that's been a question for a long time. I think the historic answer is we're a very big country, and so traveling distances in city to city here just takes a long time on a train, even on a high-speed rail. But really the answer is we invested heavily in cars. We built the, you know, highway system, a miracle really, and we invested in planes. So in the middle of the century, the train system which we had built, which started in the 19th century with the Transcontinental Railway, built by 3 private companies with public help in 6 years.
And no right-of-way problems.
No right-of-way problems. You know, we abandoned all of that. Now you have a lot of property that's owned, you have a lot of other interests and legal obstacles, and we've created a regulatory system, let's face it, that makes it very, very difficult to build even an elevator in a single New York City subway station.
Or to renovate Penn Station.
Yes, yes. So the obstacles are enormous, and the costs, the public costs, are extraordinarily high. In California, this high-speed rail project, which has been in the works for years and has so far gone nowhere, is looking at a price tag well north of $100 billion, possibly 120. And they're hoping maybe in a decade they'll go between Merced and Bakersfield, 2 cities in the Central Valley of California that nobody asked for a high-speed rail in.
Right. That you could take your time getting between.
Right.
Is there any vision to create high-speed rail in the Northeast Corridor, Washington, New York, Boston?
So I think there are
or higher speed at least?
Right. So I think there are 2 answers here. One is the hope of Brightline is that the success of its trains, the popularity of a train between Vegas and LA and in Florida, will increase the appetite, the public appetite, and show people what something like that looks like. High speed in California means that train will go about 186 miles an hour. That's or more, 200. That's real high-speed rail. And if that happens, there might be sort of a political momentum behind trying this. In the Northeast, we get back to what I was saying before. You have tracks that don't accommodate high-speed rail. High-speed rail in particular, remember, needs certain kinds of tracks to go on. They have to be pretty straight. They can't be at grade like the trains in Florida because they can't interact with existing traffic. You can't have a car trying to...
You can have a crossing. Yeah.
Right. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff in the way, and the tracks that Amtrak runs on don't accommodate high-speed rail. Could we replace them all and build that? I don't know. Can we, you know, create a colony on the moon where all New Yorkers will go for holidays? Maybe, but there's no sign that that's possible in the near future.
Pat Moynihan used to talk about maglev, which probably relies, I would imagine, less on tracks than it does on the technology of magnetism. Is that a realistic alternative, or is that some futuristic thing?
Yeah, look, I didn't mean to sound too pessimistic about New York. There's a lot of rail operations that are like this, that are exploring new technologies in East Asia and in Europe, and we are decades, generations behind in this. The technology is definitely out there, and the demand, I think, is there too. It's like a lot of our problems in this country now around housing, the list goes on. Do we have the political will and the capital? At the moment, I don't think that's where this current administration is going to be looking to spend money. But the involvement of a private company actually might be more appealing to this administration. Some of that California line has depended on federal funds through the Biden administration. It'll be interesting to see if the Trump administration finds this an interesting thing to invest in.
Michael Kimmelman, tell us about the Frick and the renovation. Sounds like a success.
It is. Like so many of these projects, there was a lot of concern in the beginning about screwing up a great landmark, understandably. The Frick, exists. It was founded in the home of Henry Frick. Then it was turned into a museum in the 1930s and expanded.
One of the last of those mansions on Fifth Avenue, right?
One of the key ones, the Cooper Hewitt, is one as well. Carnegie Mansion. There are some others, but it was a gem, a very great building. Is a very great building, I should say, designed by Carrera and Hastings, the same firm that did the 42nd Street Library. The expansion was done by John Russell Pope, one of the greatest architects in American history. So there was a lot of architectural credibility riding on this renovation, which needed to sort of fix what the Frick had never done, creating an education center, a cafe, proper conservation studios, all sorts of stuff that wasn't what people mostly experienced there. All of that required a very sort of surgical approach, and the architect Annabelle Seldorf, who also turned another mansion on 86th Street into the Neue Gallery, a really wonderful job, very discreetly found a way to sort of almost like a cardiologist to insert little corridors and stints and all these connections, and I think did a remarkable job of essentially doing beautiful new spaces, but most of all, preserving the Frick that people loved. And part of the renovation also involved opening up rooms in the Frick home that had never been open to the public. They'd just been used as offices. So the second floor of the Frick is open. It's kind of wonderful, and it's a great lesson in the fact that sometimes you should let an architect do what they want.
Has it affected the display of the art itself?
The rooms are back, and they look spanking clean. They've gone through enormous efforts to restore, for instance, the old fabric walls, beautiful French fabrics on the walls. The upstairs rooms have been completely refurbished. They'd never been seen by the public. So the mansion looks terrific. The rest of the building is pretty much the same too, but where it connects to the new areas, those connections, I think, work really well. The one big change is that there was a music room added in the 1930s, an oval music room, which became very beloved, but the truth is never had great acoustics, and it was exactly where the Frick needed to put temporary galleries, which it never had. It never had a decent place to put an exhibition. So that was removed, replaced by galleries, and a new auditorium put downstairs. The galleries blend pretty easily, and the new auditorium is a kind of tour de force. So I think people who go to the Frick will be happy to see what they saw before and amazed by what's changed.
Very quickly, you're visiting a building in Harlem that you wrote about before. What makes that so special? Very quickly.
It's called the Brotherhood Sister Soul. It's the headquarters of this youth development organization, a wonderful organization, opened a new headquarters 3 years ago. A really interesting work of architecture with a big jagged glass facade on an old street of tenements. It's a great organization. I wanted to see how the building was doing. I went back. The building's doing fine. The organization is now in the front lines, really, of the war that Trump is conducting against DEI, on education, on law firms, because the organization also provides help to some of its students, legal pro bono aid, to students. Many of them come from immigrant families. It's an interesting example of how much architecture doesn't live in a vacuum, but like the rest of us, is part of this world. And the organization is really going to be up against it now. Corporations are backing out of support from organizations like it. Federal funds have dried up. It's a difficult moment.
We look forward to reading that. Michael Kimmelman, architecture critic of the New York Times. And that's it for this edition of Close Up. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts. And don't forget to download the CUNY TV app. You can catch our weekly program on the go, anytime, anywhere.